Hi, you're listening to The Sociology Show, a podcast about absolutely anything to do with the wonderful world of sociology. Whether you're a teacher, a lecturer, a student, or just taking a passing interest, this podcast will look at a range of issues from social class, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion, crime, education, and anything else that sociology has to offer. My name is Matthew Wilkin, and each episode I will speak to someone working in the field of sociology and let them explain all about their own interests, their research, and their experiences. So, put your earphones in, turn the volume up, and let's be sociology geeks together, eh? Hello and welcome to The Sociology Show. This podcast is sponsored by Collins, high-quality student books, teacher guides, and unbeatable value revision for GCSE and A-level sociology. If you'd like to check out what they've got, then please do visit collins.co.uk and search for sociology. The Sociology Show podcast is also brought to you in association with Tutor2U, the exam performance specialists for A-level and GCSE sociology students and teachers. And so you can visit tutor2u.net/sociology, and there you can pick up revision guides, flashcards, revision videos, and everything else that you need for your A-level or GCSE sociology studies. And so this episode is an interview with Dr Christine Feldman-Barrett. I chatted to Christine about all things to do with youth subcultures. Christine is the author of 2 books, We Are the Mods, and also A Women's History of the Beatles. So without further ado, let's go over to the interview with Dr. Christine Feldman-Barrett. Christine, thank you for joining me.
Oh, thanks for inviting me. It's great to be here.
Thank you very much. And we're on a little bit of a time difference, aren't we? How far ahead are you, did you say?
I think Brisbane is about 10 hours ahead of the UK.
10 hours ahead, right? It's -2 here as we're recording first thing in the morning. I'm imagining that your temperature's a little bit different there.
Yes, it is warm. It's summertime, but no need to be too envious because it's been really grey and rainy the last several weeks. So not your typical summertime weather, I would say.
Oh, there you go. See, it's -2 here, but it's a nice clear blue sky. Christine, I always ask people to start by telling us a little bit about who they are and what they do, if you don't mind.
Sure, no problem. So my name's Christine Feldman-Barrett, and I am an American academic who has been living and working in Australia for the last 10 years now. And my position at Griffith University is as a sociologist and a cultural sociologist, but actually my background is a lot more interdisciplinary than that. My PhD is actually in communication and cultural studies from the University of Pittsburgh, and my supervisor, or as we call them in the States, my advisor, he was actually a cultural historian of media. So my way to sociology has been not the most direct one, I would say. But during the time I was doing my PhD, which was on the mod subculture starting in the 1960s and going into the present, I was definitely studying and reading a lot of sociological work, especially subcultural studies, I would say, and youth culture studies. So I would say the best way to describe the work I do now within cultural sociology is that I'm a youth culture historian. So I combine cultural sociology and history, especially in terms of my methods and approach.
Thank you. And I'm interested, how did you end up in Australia? You said you're from Pittsburgh originally, is that right?
Well, I'm originally from Chicago, and like a lot of Americans, we tend to move around a lot for study and for work. So I actually left, my dad was also an academic. So we moved from my hometown of Chicago to Minneapolis, St. Paul when I was 16. And then I went to university out on the West Coast near Seattle. But then I did my master's degree and my doctoral work on the East Coast at Georgetown first in Washington, D.C. for the MA, and then Pittsburgh for the PhD. So, I probably moved around I probably moved around more than your typical American, but I guess that made me really open in terms of where I might move for a full-time or tenure track position. So when it came time to applying for jobs, I really applied everywhere. So in Europe, universities all across the US, of course, Canada, and then for this job in Australia. And I think I was really motivated to apply for the position, first of all, because it really suited my skills and the things I had studied. They were looking for someone who was interested in things like youth culture studies and transnational analyses, and that's what I had done. And somebody who was already here at Griffith University in Queensland was Andy Bennett. And I had really looked at a lot of his work during my PhD, and of course knew his name, and also had reached out to him at certain points later on when I was finishing up my PhD. So he was a familiar name. And in fact, he also wrote the foreword to my first book, We Are the Mods, which came out in 2009. So the job announcement came out a bit later, and I just thought, okay, well, that sounds interesting. And I've been to Australia before, so why not apply? And I did, and here I am 10 years later.
It's a beautiful part of the world as well, of course.
It is.
You just mentioned your first book, We Are the Mods. I'm interested to know how you got interested in that. I'm myself really interested in mods and rockers. I live in Brighton.
Oh, wow.
So, of course, if you live in Brighton, then you've got to be interested in it. You know, we still have the mods and rockers meetups here a couple of times a year, and there's plenty of mod shops still in certain parts of Brighton. So for yourself, where did your interest come from it?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because a lot of the things that I study now really do come from lifelong interests. So with mod culture, and specifically the original 60s mod subculture, I was probably first introduced to it when I was about 10 years old, and I have a sister who's 5 years older. And she took me to see, I think she was babysitting one night, you know, she was looking after me while our parents were out. And she really wanted to go see a double feature of The Kids Are All Right, which is a documentary about The Who, with Quadrophenia. So I think we didn't end up staying for all of Quadrophenia because it was the second film and it was getting quite late. But I just remember thinking, oh, these are mods, because I guess I thought the mods were more like the Beatles because of having seen A Hard Day's Night. And Ringo, in a famous scene in A Hard Day's Night, is asked if he's a mod or a rocker. So I thought the Beatles had something to do with it. And I think in American culture, the Beatles were always de facto tied in with the term mod, because mod in the States just eventually came to mean anything that was trendy and of the moment, and especially British, you know, things coming from Britain, like the mini skirts and all the fashions and all the music. So when I saw Quadrophenia, I thought, okay, this is different. This is a different kind of youth culture or group of teenagers than I thought. So that really intrigued me. And as I got older, I obviously learned more about what mod is, what mod was, all the different permutations of mod, all the offshoots of mod. And I guess it was when I was at Georgetown as an MA student, we read an excerpt from Dick Hebdage's Subculture, The Meaning of Style, and it happened to be the section where he really talks a lot about the mods. And I thought, wow, okay, so this is something that's been studied academically. I didn't really know that as an undergraduate. And I should mention there was a big gap between graduating with my BA and starting any sort of graduate or post-grad studies. So I had not, even though Subculture, The Meaning of Style came out in 1979, I graduated from university with my BA in 1993. I didn't go back do a master's degree until 2001. So I guess that somehow had just totally passed me by as an undergraduate. And when I started the MA and read that, I just thought, right, okay, I've always been interested in the 1960s as a historical period. I love all the music from that time, and I really want to find out what mods are really about. What is that subculture about? And why is it that there are still young people today, and we're talking about the early 2000s, but there's still mods around, as you know, especially being in Brighton, where they have a lot of weekenders and things like that. And I actually was in Brighton at least once during the time I was doing the research for the PhD, which turned into the book. I was just really fascinated in knowing what was it that motivated these latter-day mods to be mods. And so that was really the purpose behind that project and that study. Because, I had always been interested in things from the 1960s, but I never was a mod myself. I never manifested that interest in that very overt way. So, that was why I wanted to interview these folks and find out more.
Something that really interests me, actually, because obviously we've had hundreds of different kind of youth subcultures, but mod seems to have a kind of longevity that others don't. I'm teaching 16, 17-year-olds at the moment, and if I mention the word mod, they know exactly what it is, what the look is like, what the music is, the haircut, the jacket, the bike, everything. Why do you think mods is so much more in people's conscience than perhaps other youth subcultures that are less popular?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think anything that has to do with the 1960s and baby boomer culture, I think there's just always been this really intense imprint of all that onto later generations. I mean, being part of Generation X myself, I feel that I was someone who grew up very much in the shadow of the baby boomers and embracing a lot of things from the 1960s, even though that wasn't obviously part of my contemporary youth culture. But I was fascinated with it, and there always seemed to be something on TV or the oldie station on the American radio. I felt like I was always in touch with that time period through all these media messages that were floating around, if you like. And that hasn't really gone away in the sense that it still hovers around all those signs and symbols of the 1960s, whether we're talking about mod culture specifically, or even the hippie culture of the later 60s. There are always bands that are coming up, even now with people who maybe identify with Gen Z, maybe they don't specifically, but the younger generation now, you still see bands that are becoming really popular that have that sort of 60s lilt to what they're doing, whether it's more modish or psychedelic or that kind of later 60s sort of proto prog rock kind of style. And I'm thinking specifically, for instance, in terms of the psychedelic 60s, a band like Tame Impala from Western Australia, and they're pretty well known around the world now. But there are always those bands that seem to come up that do have that kind of mod tinge to them. And it could be even more so the style. And like you said, you're teaching students that have an awareness of that. And I think in the UK, it's even stronger, of course, and in Brighton, certainly, than in the States or in Australia. But here the students still kind of get, when I've talked about my research in certain classes that I teach a course called Sociology of Youth, and we talk about youth transitions, literature and sociology, but then of course youth culture, and I'll bring up the mods, and it isn't difficult to explain, and the students may see one snapshot of mods on a slide and they'll think, oh yeah, I know someone who dresses like that. I didn't realize they were a mod, but okay, or at least they're influenced by that mod style to a certain degree. So yeah, I think it's just, there's something about the look, the sound of the music, that continues to be appealing. And I do wonder how long that will last, but it certainly seems to be lingering in youth culture to different degrees. And I guess it also depends on where you are in the world too. I think it's always going to be much stronger in the UK than pretty much anywhere else.
Yeah, I just wondered if some of it is slightly timeless. The green Parker jacket, for example, is bought out every winter by most UK Brits. It's kind of a timeless classic and the same for the female kind of look as well. I think,
yes,
it's adopted by all generations, actually.
Yeah, and it just looks good. And it's something that you can continue on with as you get older, And Andy Bennett, who I mentioned before, he's written quite a bit, as has someone like Paul Hodkinson. They've written about subcultures and aging. And that is, a whole different area that I think is really important in sociology, this idea that what we think of or what we have thought of as youth culture styles or lifestyles, those things can really continue on to be a core aspect of someone's identity, even if they're, 40, 50 years old.
Absolutely. And do you touch on the work of Stan Cohen at all in reference to the Modern Rockers?
Yes, I did. I did in the book and of course, in the States, we call the dissertation. I know it's called the thesis here and in the UK. So definitely I did. As I said before, my approach within the cultural sociology space, it definitely connects and cites the classic work that's out there in terms of subcultural studies and youth culture studies. But I also really bring in work from other disciplines too, so cultural anthropology and media studies for sure, and what might loosely be thought of as cultural studies as well, and certainly history. I mean, for me, it's really that bridging of the theories that come from sociology, but I'm always interested in the past, I have to say. And I guess that's how I've carved a niche out for myself in terms of youth culture studies by being a youth culture historian, because I'm trying to look at everything within that socio-historic lens, that I'm interested in how things like that whole idea within youth studies of agency, among young people, and the constraints they have to deal with, structure and agency, that whole question. I'm really interested in how that plays out in the past versus I think a lot of sociologists tend to look at things in the contemporary moment. But I really do like looking back and seeing what those things meant. What did it mean to be a young person in the 1960s versus the 1980s versus the 2010s? How do things change? What things remain the same? I'm really interested in that. So I love doing research that can marry those two disciplines together, I guess you could say.
The Sociology Show podcast relies on the kind contributions of sponsorship and donations. If you enjoy the show, then you can help with the hosting costs by donating as little as £5 on the GoFundMe page. Simply visit uk.gofundme.com and search for The Sociology Show. If you can donate, then you will be sent a Sociology Show pen as a small thank you for your continued support of the show.
You've already mentioned one band. You mentioned the Beatles, okay? And that brings us on to your other book, A Women's History of the Beatles. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that, how it got started, what it's all about?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I mentioned before with the Mods project, the Beatles is also a topic in and of itself that I've been interested in since I was even younger than when I saw Quadrophenia. I would say that I've been aware of the Beatles and interested in the Beatles since I was about 5 or 6 years old. And that's been the one constant in my life, I would say, is the interest in this iconic band, now iconic band. And one thing I've noticed in all of the Beatles literature that I had read, say, up to the early 2000s, even when I was still doing my PhD, but I was reading a lot of Beatles books for pleasure, and I was reading academic books as well as general readership books. I noticed that there was a very stereotypical way of talking about female fans within Beatles history, that female fans were collectively the shrieking mass of hysterical pubescent girls. And I thought, first of all, there's more to the story than that. And there are different women within Beatles history that should be given more attention or should be paid more attention. So it's not just this one subset of quote unquote Beatlemaniacs, but I think there's a bigger history about women within the Beatles story that I'd like to explore at some point. And I remember talking with my sister about it in, say, 2005, because again, my sister Mariana comes up again because she really influenced me a lot in terms of pop culture. She's 5 years older, and so she was leading the way with bringing certain records home, and we would watch movies from the 1960s, say, late at night on TV when we were a little bit older. And the Beatles were very much a part of our growing up. So that's the long answer, is that I've always been interested in the Beatles. And I thought women's stories about the Beatles were missing. And also there had been no women authors writing these Beatles biographies. There had been women who were fans in the 1960s who were writing memoirs, but there was no kind of biography or academic cultural history about the Beatles written by a woman scholar. So I felt, as someone who had followed the Beatles all my life and who now was in the position academically with my scholarship to look at the story as a youth culture historian with also this gendered lens kind of applied to it all, I felt that I was ready to do that. So I started the research in earnest, I would say, in 2016. And then the book came out February this year, A Women's History of the Beatles. And it's just coming out in paperback at the end of February. So yes, it's been a long and winding road, if I may be so cliched saying that. But it's been a long time coming, and it's gotten a really good response from both academics and non-academics. So I'm really happy about that. As you know, all academics want their work read, and it's been nice to see it doing so well, also with, just a general audience and not just specifically an academic audience, though certainly I'm happy that my peers within academia are saying nice things about the book too.
That's great. That's great. Sounds like a labor of love kind of project, if you don't mind me saying.
Oh, definitely. And there's no denying that. I mean, it definitely was something that was motivated both by head and heart. And so, yeah, I have no qualms about affirming that or confirming that. Absolutely.
And what about your kind of methodology? You mentioned, the historical element. What else did you use for your methods to collect your data?
Yeah, so certainly there's the ethnographic part of it. And with the Maud's book and with the Beatles book, the same methodology was used in terms of loosely structured, semi-structured interviews, either in person, but because I really wanted to get mainly women from, English-speaking countries, so the UK and the States as well as Australia, but there were some other people who came on board from other countries as well. But they were semi-structured interviews. So I started with putting the word out through different professional and personal circles. And then from there, it was really snowballing sampling that I used because there were ultimately a lot of women who I interviewed who wanted to have their friends or acquaintances who they knew were also really invested Beatles fans to be a part of the project. There were some women who I sought out and just emailed cold because I knew that their story had to do with this history. So, for instance, there's a musician named Patty Quattro Erickson who formed a band in 1964 with some of her sisters and a few friends. They were called the Pleasure Seekers, and they formed because Patty had gone to see the Beatles play at a stadium in Detroit in 1964, and the Beatles phenomenon was the whole impetus for her starting this all-female rock band. And so there's one chapter in the book that focuses on women musicians. So because I had done the research already and knew that there were some women who had this part to play within the history, I did reach out to them specifically, but mostly it was more general announcements that were sent out through different means. And many of the interviews were done through Skype, and others were done in person. And then there was the option for some people who didn't want to do a synchronous interview, that basically the same structure of questions were sent out in questionnaire format to people who wanted more time to think about their responses and wanted to write them down. So that was the way I collected the ethnographic data, but it was by and large mostly interviews for that. Yeah, synchronous interviews with a few asynchronous responses coming in. So that was the ethnographic part. And then in terms of the more archival research, most of that, or I would say a big portion of that, was done when I went over to the UK and did research at the British Library, the Liverpool Public Library. I also looked at some special collections at John Moores University in Liverpool as well. So yeah, I would say that was also quite similar to the kind of research I did with the MODS project too. It combined interviewing with looking at primary sources from the different eras that I was looking at. But primarily, as you can imagine, I started with looking at everything from the 1960s during the Beatles' heyday, and also the starting point of mod culture.
Thank you. And what was kind of your overall findings? Was it the fact that kind of women have been hidden in this respect, or their stories hadn't been told?
Yeah, exactly. I just felt like there was a lot of nuance and detail missing from Beatles history in terms of who were the women who were there in the 1960s, but also there hadn't really been any ethnographic work done around the later generations of fans. So as I mentioned before, I'm a Gen Xer, so I would consider myself a second generation Beatles fan. I was born in the 1970s, so completely missed the Beatles in their day. But there are also fans who are much younger than me. And I believe the youngest person I interviewed, the youngest woman I interviewed, was born in 1996. But since then, yeah, I was pretty impressed with that. But since then, I found through Twitter, especially the Twitter Beatles fan space, there are some really young Beatles fans out there, you know, who are still teenagers, who are very active on Twitter, asserting, you know, how much the Beatles mean to them. So like you were saying with mod, that's continued on in younger generations, or an awareness or interest in that. But the Beatles being a lot more mainstream than mod, wow, you know, there are a lot of young people who are still quite dedicated Beatles fans and keeping that fandom alive. But in terms of the research I did, yeah, the youngest person I interviewed was born in the mid-90s. And it was good to interview those three generations of women who had been really interested in the Beatles, considered themselves fans, so I could trace that history as well to see what was it about the different eras and the different ways of getting into the Beatles that might have been, you know, certainly we know it would have been different because the Beatles was not a contemporary phenomenon when people would have been teenagers in the 80s or the 90s or the 2000s. But, what was it that got them interested in that? So in that way, there's a parallel to the mod research, because I'm really interested in how these cultural phenomena take hold and how they continue to circulate and be of so much interest to people even decades later. But I would also say what was very important to me too was to just foreground women's experiences of the Beatles in different ways, whether it was looking purely at the fandom or looking at the Beatles as a motivator for doing other things. So there's one chapter, for instance, in the book where I'm focusing on women whose careers in some way have been prompted by their Beatles fandom. And that's something that I hadn't really seen before. I hadn't seen anything written about that. So whether it was women who became Beatles tour guides, women who became authors, or artists or fashion designers, and that really the Beatles had inspired them creatively, that was a story that I wanted to also tell.
There's going to be a lot of people listening who say they want to get it. So I think now's a good opportunity to do a bit of plugging. Where can people get the book? You just said the paperback version's out as well. Is that right?
Yeah, the paperback is out at the end of February, but I believe that you can already pre-order it. It's through Bloomsbury Academic. So the Bloomsbury website is probably the main place you want to go. But other booksellers, like Amazon and so on, will also have it available for pre-order at this point.
That's brilliant. Thank you. And Christine, could I ask you if you're happy to give out your details if people want to get in touch or maybe follow you on Twitter?
Yeah, sure. Twitter is kind of the main space that I engage in all conversations about this. So people can follow me at Feldman-Barrett, and that's all run together as one, and it's capitalized. So Dr. Christine Feldman-Barrett at Feldman-Barrett, and both Feldman and Barrett are capitalized but run together. Yeah, so people can definitely contact me through Twitter.
Brilliant. Thank you. And it's your the other book you mentioned, We Are the Mods, that's still available as well?
It is. I'm not sure if I know they did a few runs of it in terms of printing. So I think it still would be available through Peter Lang, probably. But there are certainly other ways to find it as well, either new or used at this point. And I believe it also is at many libraries around the world, according to WorldCat, as is A Women's History of the Beatles. So if you can find it through your university library or local library, that's another place to check those out.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Christine. I really do appreciate it, especially trying to organise it with the time difference. But thank you very much for your time today.
Oh, thanks a lot, Matthew. It's been great talking with you.
Take care. Bye now.
Bye. Thank you.
The Sociology Show podcast relies on the kind contributions of sponsorship and donations. If you enjoy the show, then you can help with the hosting costs by donating as little as £5 on the GoFundMe page. Simply visit uk.gofundme.com and search for The Sociology Show. If you can donate, then you will be sent a Sociology Show pen as a small thank you for your continued support of the show.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast. If you would like to contact the show or be interviewed, then please email the sociologyshowpodcast@gmail.com.